All right, good morning, everyone. I'm Helder Sebastio, professor of practice in entrepreneurship and innovation at the University of San Diego, and I will be your moderator for today. And it's my pleasure to host this session called Developing Relevant Capabilities for Entrepreneurs. We're going to have two speakers, and because they have some distinctly different topics, they've asked that they'll do their presentation and then they'll do the Q&A. So as opposed to other sessions where you had if you had two speakers and did the Q&A at the end, we'll do speaker Q&A, speaker Q&A. And our first speaker is just Jeff Hornsby, the Henry Block, Missouri Endowed Chair of Entrepreneurship and Innovation at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. And I'm not going to read that whole heading. You can see what his topic is for today. And then our second presenters will be Kurt Jacobs, who is an assistant professor of practice at University of Tennessee, Knoxville, volunteers. And then Jamie Darnell is his co-presenter from Penn State, clinical professor of practice. So without further ado, I turn it over to Jeff.
Thanks, Holder. So this topic on entrepreneurial competency has been something I've been kind of working on off and on for the last 10 years. And it all started, I got frustrated because I'm in Kansas City. Our major funder for our Rainier Institute for Entrepreneurship and Innovation is the Kauffman Foundation. A lot of you probably know about the Kauffman Foundation because they fund a lot of entrepreneurial things, especially in the greater Kansas City area. And they kept coming to me and saying, we want your proposal to talk about how many startups are going to come out of your student programs and curriculum, how many jobs, how many people are being hired by these ventures, and how much money are they raising? And most of us that teach undergraduate entrepreneurship know that most of our students coming out of an undergraduate program don't usually start a business right away. Very few do, and a lot of them kind of fail early on. And we kind of want them to fail early. Now, we have accelerator programs and things like that to try to head that off, but so that frustration grew, and then I've known Rebecca White for a long time, but she started getting this area of competency measurement, and it really intrigued me that can we come up with a distinctive set of competencies that we can use to measure the success of our entrepreneurship programs without getting into the metrics of how many, we track it now even better than before, number of startups and what they're doing, and we're doing more long range, year-by-year analysis of that, but it's hard to do. So I wanted to come up with a different way of measuring, are we moving the needle? And so I'm part of a research team of Mark Schenkel at Belmont, Rodney D'Souza at Texas Christian, and myself that have been working on this project. And now we're working with Brian Anderson, who's now at University of Kansas, Department Chair of Management there. He was our Associate Dean at UMKC until last year on this project of developing an assessment instrument for competency. That's not what I'm talking about today. That'll be the leaping off point at the end of this. So I'm kind of giving you the abridged version of a paper that is under review right now at a journal, and I would be glad to share that paper with you all if you want to email me. So one of the first things to start off with is definitional issues. Many of us use the term skills and competencies interchangeably, but they're not. A competency is the person's knowledge and behaviors that lead to successful activity, whereas skills are the specific learned abilities that you need to perform a given activity well. So competencies then are made up of a number of skills. So opportunity recognition is a competency, we think. A lot of literature points to that. There's a lot of skills that are involved in opportunity recognition. So that, when you think about it that way, it kind of makes sense. Competency-based education has been around for a long time. And traditional models of curriculum design are usually based on identifying learning objectives and learning outcomes. Now, the problem is, in education, and I'm guilty of it, we tend to teach to the outcomes, the objectives. Because we have these Office of Assessment where we have to assess our programs for all of our accreditation and things like that. Competency-based education, though, is designed to develop and assess the mastery of knowledge and skills. So that's different. Mastering how to recognize opportunities. Mastering how to assess feasibility. Those types of things. So 4 critical arguments made by Rebecca White and her colleagues back about 8 years ago. The reason why we need to focus on competencies: increased competition from non-traditional educational services. Online and distance education offerings, we're inundated with that right now. If you're not feeling the competition from national offerings it's not the University of Phoenix anymore. It's the University of Illinois. It's many other programs that are offering online programs across the country, and especially expedited by the pandemic. There's no common language for competencies in the entrepreneurship discipline. So it's all over the place. So we got to fix that before we can measure anything. The growth in experiential programs such as competitions, boot camps, workshops, and networking programs. We're launching our business pitch competition today and giving away about $100,000 at the finals next Friday afternoon. So I'll be there then, but I was able to slip out now because thankfully I have a really good team that's leading the competition. The first part's online today. Assessing learning in entrepreneurship is a challenge. Assessing learning in any class we teach is a challenge. We tend to punt and just give tests, and the score on the tests we say represents learning. We all know better than that, though. So let me talk about some of the nascent research on competencies in entrepreneurship. So back in, when we look at entrepreneurship, a venture involves a range of challenges that are distinct from other business activities. Mike Morris, who will be here, really made that a point in his article identifying, I believe it was 13 entrepreneurial competencies. But things like opportunity recognition. Well, I would maintain, being a researcher in corporate entrepreneurship, that opportunity recognition is a competency just as valuable in a corporate setting as it is in a venture startup. But that's another talk some other time. But we're going to talk about Bacigalupo's work back in 2016 in Europe a lot towards the end of the talk here. But when we focus on entrepreneurial competencies, we recognize the need to move past focusing on traits, characteristics, and better understand the set of activities that lead to entrepreneurial decision-making and success. So we're moving past, that stuff should have died back in the 80s when there's a lot of research in that area, because we know there's no consistent set of traits or characteristics that differentiate an entrepreneur from, say, a successful manager or leader. There might be behaviors or competencies, but we know the research never really proved that out. So Baum in 1994, one of the earliest folks to talk about entrepreneurial competencies, if you look in the education literature, you'll find a lot of work on competency-based education in many fields as a foundation for what we're talking about here. But he identified 9 entrepreneurship competencies. And he got this not an empirical study. He just read all the literature that he could find. If you think about 1994, entrepreneurship was very nascent in terms of its development as a research field. We've come a long way, which has given us the legitimacy to stand as a major force in a business school these days in what we do. But he talked about cognitive ability, self-management, administration, people skills, decision skills, leadership, opportunity recognition, opportunity development, and knowledge domain. So, and those kind of make sense. Mann, Lau, and Chan, I put this in here because I really like, they came up with this model. And you're going to see we're proposing a model that is reflection or builds off of a lot of what they propose. But the idea here is that they want to look at a process-focused format using behaviorally based competency areas to show how the entrepreneurial process works. And so the idea is that these 6 suggested competencies combined with competitive scope and organizational capabilities leads to venture or firm performance. So the 6 competencies, they looked at actively seeking learning opportunities, learning continuously, learning selectively and purposely, learning in depth into the trade, improving, reflecting upon experience, and transferring what has been learned to current practice. This is interesting, but it really isn't that applied to entrepreneurship. It's really applied to a lot of different managerial or business activities. Morris and his colleagues in 2013 wanted to come up with a distinctive set of entrepreneurial competencies that were different from managerial competencies. And this is a study that was done in Journal of Small Business Management. It's cited a lot. And it was one of the first ones that really tried to empirically derive competencies. And I think the biggest contribution of that work was first empirically driving competencies, and second, say we have to distinguish this from other business practices. They felt like competencies were considered as an outgrowth of learning of scripts deriving the interactions between individual and the environment. So your work in the environment affects how you behave. So they came up with 13 competencies: opportunity recognition, assessing opportunity, mitigating and managing risk, conveying a compelling vision, tenacity, creative problem solving, resource leveraging, guerrilla skills, value creation through innovation, adaptation, resilience, self-efficacy, and building and managing social networks. So a lot of that makes sense. And if you built the entrepreneurship course around that, you probably have a pretty good basics of intro to entrepreneurship. Now, the interesting thing is there was no other, until recently, there's not a lot of work that's been done with these competencies to see if they actually do predict entrepreneurial success. And that's the next step. So in 10 years, that hasn't been done. Now, a great qualitative study was done in 2016 by Bacigalupo and colleagues, and it was called EntreComp. If you ever just Google EntreComp, and they have a whole booklet on the whole process that they went through to derive their suggested competencies. And it is a good starting off point. It's a comprehensive framework based on qualitative research across the European continent. And it's developed based on a survey approach, an iterative survey approach. So they surveyed entrepreneurs, entrepreneurship educators, on what they thought were the competencies people needed. Then they narrowed it down, just like we would do in an item development exercise using factor analysis and other statistical techniques to filter items down to ones that would cluster and then correlate together, then predict, hopefully, meaningful things like startups or success or whatever. In its very simplest form, EntreComp focuses on 3 what I would call meta competencies. So 3 meta competencies, and this is how it works. So 3 meta competencies of into action, resources, and ideas and opportunities. And within that, there's 5 sub-competencies. And then if you look at their work, there's several sub-competencies under those. Creates a really nice framework. So I think this is getting at where we're going in terms of a model for entrepreneurial competency. The idea that there's some antecedents like person-team characteristics, opportunity enabling conditions, the environment and things like that. It leads to the formation of an idea that then it leads to the three competencies as suggested by Bacigalupo and by some research we've done that it hasn't been published yet. We're still collecting more data that shows that we took and did a factor analysis of all the items I just showed you prior to this model. And they always filter down to two meta competencies: opportunity recognition and resilience. So we keep coming up with 2 to 3, matching what Bacigalupo did empirically. Now we're going to start looking at, we did a prolific study to do that. Now we're going to start using actual entrepreneurs in student entrepreneurs in a sample starting this fall. But those three, the amount of competencies you have then leads to entrepreneurial self-efficacy, your belief that you can succeed. You have the competency, which then leads to the action of the behavior, which is moderated by your own motivation. If you know any of my past work on entrepreneurial motivation, you'd understand why that's in there. And then e-learning, so things like our accelerator programs and our actual formal curriculum enhance the actual action and behavior, which leads to positive entrepreneurial outcomes. I'm a big believer in starting off with a research model and then testing the linkages for that. I just want to quickly lead to, I won't go into all of them, but we need to study this empirically. Bacigalupo did a great job qualitatively. We need to continue. It's not enough to say we're settling on 2 or 3 meta competencies. We have to say these meta competencies, if we can enhance them, and then does that lead to entrepreneurial successes? However we define those dependent variables. We need to look at the context where entrepreneurship is happening. I know Jill talked about social entrepreneurship this morning. I'm big researching into corporate entrepreneurship and have an instrument that's pretty well known in that area. But we need to look at how does the competencies change depending on the context of entrepreneurship, and what does that mean? And then we also have to kind of look at the other influences that impact entrepreneurial learning, not only in universities, but our accelerator programs and community programs and things like that. I think if we can start nailing this down, we will advance our field and be able to answer those questions. Are we moving the needle? I'll end there. Please email me if you want the full paper. I just gave you the 15-minute abridged version, but hopefully I raised some issues in your mind.
Thank you, Jeff. We have time for a few questions, if anybody has any questions.
Thank you, Jeff. Fantastic work. Thank you very much for your presentation. I have a question. Context. At Tec de Monterrey in Mexico, we redesigned the entire curriculum from medical school, engineering, business school, based on competency-based education. Mm-hmm. And it's very interesting. One challenge that we continue having, particularly in entrepreneurship, is how to correctly measure the competency development, right? So how to balance between measuring the competencies, measuring the knowledge, the skills and the knowledge as well. So what is your take? What are the instruments that you envisioned for measuring the development of the entrepreneurship competencies?
That's a great question. We worked on a questionnaire based on our research, our initial prolific study, which was based on writing items based on the Bacigalupo work, and using items from the past research, and start working on that. We identified 2 meta competencies with that, the opportunity recognition and resiliency. I think we have to know, when we talk about competency-based education in general, it's learning, application, mastery are the 3 major levels we talk about in competency-based education. We're really good at assessing the learning part, right? We design a curriculum, we assess I don't know if tests are the full answer to that. I think coaching and mentoring, evaluations, and because you can't test for behaviors really well, and that's what competency really get at. So are we changing behaviors? Because I was guilty of this. I was really good at memorizing in college. I could memorize anything, and I would take a test, and really a week later, I'd have to study again to go take that test. I mean, it didn't change behavior. That's why you need to get into the application part of it. And I think that's the big hurdle. How do we assess for the application?
I don't know if it's a question, more so a statement about the work that this team is doing in entrepreneurial competencies, because as we continue to rethink and get our students to re-engage, I mean, Jeff brings out some really important points, because it's competencies that help us to design an integrated, effective set of both curricular and co-curricular activities to help our students. And Jeff brings out a real important point about mastery from an assessment perspective, as opposed to did they learn this or not. There's a big difference between that versus mastery. So this is really, really important work that is going to have an impact on future programs. So thank you, Jeff, for the work that you're doing in this area. It's really important.
Hi. My question relates to this. Entrepreneurial competencies are not deployed only in entrepreneurial projects. I think they're very valuable throughout life. And life is a series of projects that, if it's lived to the fullest, it's a series of projects that we design, we execute, and then decide whether we are successful or not. So do you think that the measurement tools for entrepreneurial competencies should go outside the entrepreneurial realm or not?
Well, being someone that researches in corporate entrepreneurship, and back in the day when it was entrepreneurship, and fought reviewers time and time again because they said you can't be entrepreneurial within an organization. Thankfully, we were able to fight that battle in getting a piece in Strategic Management Journal back in 1990 on corporate entrepreneurship and assessing it. That was a big boost in corporate entrepreneurship. But that's the whole idea of an entrepreneurial mindset. When isn't being good at opportunity recognition? When isn't it to be resilient? When is it not good to be able to look at really instinctively look at the feasibility of something? I would feel guilty if I taught our 300 and some odd entrepreneurship majors each year that they couldn't go out and apply this without, if they're not going to start a venture, they can't apply this. They're really good at business development. They're really good at idea formation and business planning and assessing the feasibility and pitching that internally. Those are generalizable skills, and I think that's what you're getting at. And that's what when I was at Kansas State University, we used to come to Kansas City and do a parents' meeting, and all the parents would come up to my son or daughter wants to major in entrepreneurship. But can't they get a job? And so I actually work with our career counseling folks to talk about the skill sets that come out and the placements. I don't know if you ever heard of Cerner. Now it's Oracle Cerner, founded in Kansas City. They next to Epic, they're the second largest medical records management company in the world. They hired a ton of our entrepreneurship majors because of that skill set.
Okay, we'll conclude on that thought for now, but obviously there's a lot more discussion to be had in this area. Thank you, Jeff. And now I'll invite Kurt and Jamie up to the stage to talk about no-code app development.
Hello, welcome everyone. My name is Jamie Darnell. I'm from Penn State University, Smeal College of Business. I'm an assistant clinical professor of entrepreneurship, soon to be associate though. And my colleague here, Kurt Jacobs. Do you want to introduce yourself, Kurt?
I'm Kurt.
A man of many words. Anyway, so we're here to share with you a teaching exercise that we've developed over the last few years called No-Code Apps for basically the post-pandemic economy. Now, I know what you might be thinking at this point. Jamie, apps, it's a mature market. Yes, I used to agree with this. I used to, before the pandemic, strongly discourage my students from working on app-based businesses. But I've changed my mind as Kurt and I have developed this exercise over the last couple of years for a couple of reasons that I hope you will find today interesting. One is the app economy hasn't gone away. If anything, my students are proposing app-based businesses more than they used to after that, after the pandemic. Also, this is really a good piece for experiential learning, if any of you, and probably most of you are into that teaching. So at the end of a class, students will have an artifact basically that they've created, either as standalone or part of a group of things that you might have them do. And then it also gives them some knowledge about the app industry, which they actually don't know, although they think they're app experts. So we're going to walk you through some of the terminology here. This is an abridged version, so we won't walk you through how to build an app yourself, and we won't show you any student work, but if you are interested in any of that stuff further, just send us an email or message on the Whova app, and we'll be happy to talk about some of that. So we're going to kind of explain to you what are no-code, low-code apps, because you should be aware of them and you should consider using them in your classes. For context, my classes I teach in the entrepreneurship minor at the university, which has students from outside the business college and inside the business college. I've used it for individual students that are interested in apps. Kurt has actually made all of his students do it, so he's sort of forced some of them into doing it, and he's going to take over from here.
All right, so I want to add a couple pieces here to add what Jamie introed as more of the problem statement. So, and this, I'm going to try and dovetail a little bit into what Jeff was talking about with his presentation, even though we don't have a lot of ties that bind here. Kind of the concept of build, measure, learn, right? So the lean methodology and kind of its application within entrepreneurship. And really, ultimately, one of the things that for the entrepreneurship curriculum that I inherited at a couple of the places that I teach entrepreneurship is the lack of experiential education, or the lack of the students or the aspiring entrepreneurs really kind of ability to get their hands dirty, right? So again, they're good at ideation, they're good at putting together a business plan, they're good at doing the pitch, all that kind of good stuff. But ultimately, being able to kind of build out, whether they're minimum viable products or experiments, customer discovery, prototypes, all that kind of chain of the build out of the product or service value proposition itself to the end customer was lacking, okay? And so how we kind of integrated that, and Jamie and I do this in a lot of different ways, app development being one of them, but really kind of the concept of no code, even for our non-tech founders to be able to utilize, whether it's app-based solutions, whether it's building e-commerce platforms, and then really getting a hands-on experience of not just the design and the development, the customer discovery component, but also added skills like the application of some of these things, like search engine optimization, website design, you name it, app design, et cetera. So here we have user-based apps, right? Or apps as they're known on our smartphones. A lot of the pitches that we get at our universities are app-based pitches, app-based solutions to existing problems in the marketplace. A lot of times new startup ideas, especially from Gen Z, and millennials as well, look to kind of deliver an app as part of this new venture solution, because this is something within their knowledge corridor. It's something they use and live on every day, okay? And so there's been a proliferation of low-code and no-code building app platforms. They're making it easier and more scalable than ever. You're seeing even some of the no-code functionality being able to be scalable and taken to be available on platforms like Apple, iOS or Android, all that kind of good stuff. A lot of new software platforms provide kind of student startups with a viable option of launching these quickly, efficiently, cheaply, okay? There's really no longer any needed for founder to kind of have coding experience. And of course now with the rise of AI and OpenAI and ChatGPT, maybe even less so, okay? A lot of apps are based on the concept of spreadsheet, which many entrepreneurship, as far as the back end engineering or data repository, that a lot of entrepreneurship students, finance students, business students, engineering students are familiar with. A lot of the apps are not only simplistic in nature, they can kind of be complex, but also be able to scale as well. So low code and no code, not the same. So when we say no code, essentially just doing a lot of the behind the scenes data packaging, allowing for kind of drag and drop functionality or process step functionality that a startup or a founder can basically put in play without actually knowing how to do the coding language itself. Low code, typically for the developers, there's still a low amount of code knowledge that needs to take place, all that kind of good stuff. So the no-code app here kind of provides platforms this user-friendly interface that they're able to work with and kind of controls the functions of the app, but doesn't require coding. A lot of no-code apps allow our diverse groups of employees, really the non-tech background, the non-IT background, the non-coding background, to engage in development. And the reason this is important is, and I don't know what everybody's experience is here, Jamie runs an across-campus minor. And so it pulls from all different majors and all that kind of good stuff. I get students from across campus as well. And whether I run this in the graduate school or we run this in the undergraduate school, it's pretty typical that if one of the solutions is a technical solution, one of two things happens. If I have non-tech founders that come up with a tech solution-based business, their first part of kind of coming up with how they are going to solve for this is outsource. Outsource it all, right? Easy, we'll just get somebody else to do it. There's all kinds of different platforms where we can pay this, that, or the other, or we'll even overestimate what that might cost, all that kind of good stuff, and it'll all be outsourced. Of course, then the question becomes, why do they need you, right? So what value proposition are you bringing to the table to make this your venture rather than it being their venture, if it's so easy to be outsourced? So anytime we pair our engineers with our business students, a lot of times the engineers are running in the other directions because the business students just want to run their idea. And so to make sure that the non-tech founders not only know, but can take part in the actual design and the requirements and implementation of some of this, a lot of the no-code application, no-code tools across a lot of the tech platforms now allow for this to take place, okay? So no coding experience, no problem, right? Whether we have them build things in app-based solutions or e-commerce-based solutions, they don't need to know HTML, they don't need to know C++, they don't need to know any of this. It's literally drag and drop and process function programming, essentially. They can build in public, they can build in real time that follows our build, measure, learn, lean functionality, right? So they can actually get feedback on the fly as they look to design, as they look to problem solve, and do real-time customer discovery, okay? On design, all that kind of good stuff before launch. They can also start to kind of understand what the true requirements are if they did need to outsource any component of this, to get a little bit better estimation on what some of the costs truly are or capital requirements would be to actually stand this up, okay? So really this kind of follows the bootstrapping 101, being able to do more with less, and follows kind of the different EO dimensions of innovativeness and proactiveness, right? So this is a list of a lot of no-code options that are out there. So ones that we have used, we've used Bubble, right? We've used Glide. And these are just kind of different no-code options. There's many more than these that are out there. They come online all the time. There's startups, whether they're coming out of the Valley, internationally, all that kind of good stuff that are looking to kind of solve for this, make it easier, faster, simpler, cheaper to get these things stood up, okay? So the good news for that is it gives our students a lot of tools to be able to do this. The downside of this is it takes this saturated market and actually lowers the barrier of entry, potentially, right? So here's, again, the kind of subsample list. Selection criteria, do you want to do no code versus low code? How much does it cost? There's a lot of free options to get started with a lot of these platforms. How easy is the design? Is it truly drag and drop? Is it more process function? The two that we use, Glide and Bubble. Glide, you can learn pretty much in a couple sessions. It's really easy to execute, especially a simple app-based solution. Bubble, a little bit more complex, going to take you a little bit more time, all that kind of good stuff. What platform compatibility does it have? Does it have e-commerce ability? Does that matter to the venture? All that kind of good stuff. So this is the recommendation if you've never done this before. We use Glide apps as kind of the starter kit. This is the one that we roll out. A lot of times you could do it even in intro to entrepreneurship, new venture planning, any of that kind of good stuff. Again, very experiential, hands-on learning. And the great thing, especially about undergrads, is you'd be amazed at when you kind of point them in the right direction with technical tools, what they're actually capable of, right? They spend their life here, so what they're able to actually get done is pretty impressive, whether it's in one class or by the end of the semester. So Glide is a no-code app that syncs up with Google Sheets. It can be the free version or up to $45 plus, depending on what kind of template, storage, number of users you want to use, all that kind of good stuff. It has some additional upcharges or incels to be able to do fees to facilitate e-commerce. But basically, it's a drag and drop, simple function. The downside is, it has some limited functionality. It's not quite scalable on some platforms, all that kind of good stuff, if they actually want to take and run with it long term. If you have questions about any of this kind of good stuff, both Jamie and myself are available for all this stuff. We've been doing the no-code stuff for a few years, yeah. So thank you for your time, and open up for questions.
Any questions?
Is this something you implement in any of your courses, or just like an extra resource for students?
So this is something that, for me, I have implemented in our new venture course. I used to have this when I used to teach intro. It was just kind of one of the, I call them sprints or labs or whatever you want to call them, where you're kind of doing hands-on activities, experiential activities. This would be one of them. To build a new app, I would kind of give them a set of criteria to kind of go and look. They come up with their own ideation and essentially do a quick either launch or utilization of an app as their minimum viable experiment or minimum viable product, basically.
I was curious about if you've experimented with Figma and if it's just too cumbersome to work in an educational environment.
I have not worked with Figma. I've heard good things in the sense of how much capability it has, but it does have some complexity with it, so the learning curve might be a little bit. I mean, I don't have experience with it, so I probably don't want to agree or disagree with that. That's just kind of the speculation that I understand it to be. It'll be interesting to see how Adobe folds that into their existing platform. Maybe they make it a little bit easier. So.
Well, Jen, it's a great job. I actually had personal interest in this because I want to pull stuff like this into our full Start R. And one of the things that caught my attention is you talked about experimentation. So you have the MVP. How do you then bridge to running the experiment with them, teach them about, even though you've built it, you got to test it, and how do you learn from it? So I'd love to hear best practices from both of you.
Doing this on Lean so that their finished product is not finished. It should be interactive with the customers, and so I think teaching them that ahead of time before you start is a really good opportunity, so that they don't feel that, oh, this is done, I created it, and I'm going to stop now, and it's perfect 100%. Because I've experienced that. You get that if you don't build that good foundation.
I think to double down on that too is that a lot of students think MVP equals prototype, a working prototype, and that is not the true role of an MVP, right? So it's really us running experiments. And so even this is a super easy way for non-tech founders to do the old wireframe build, even though there's no functionality behind it, just to kind of get the general understanding of how the app will work, what value proposition it's doing, and whatever else we're looking to test at that time from the customer.
Have you thought about these type of interventions, maybe testing the impact on entrepreneurial cognitions, such as EIEOES, orientation, intent, and self-efficacy? Have you thought about that in terms of you're doing this? Well, the big question will be is what impact are you having relative to their cognitive thinking as an entrepreneur?
For our program, we're working on building those assessments. We have not, and I think that's a major flaw. So to go back to like Jeff's
presentation earlier, that yeah, we need to be tracking those competencies, and then tracking further later on what students go on to start the businesses. And so we're working on starting a plan for my program.
Yeah. There's importance to that short tail, but long tail too, which I think a lot of us that are running programs kind of struggle with the long-term data feedback pull and connectivity with our ventures and students and all that good stuff.
Questions? We still have a few minutes left, so if there's any questions for Jeff, we can field any of those as well. Do some more networking, get a head start on lunch. You'll be the first ones in line. So thanks for coming.